First of all, thanks everyone for staying around and being part of the audience in this panel. We have an amazing group of 4 CISOs who are going to give you an idea of, well, dwelling in the dark arts and how to defend against the dark arts. But before I do that, just a quick introduction. My name is Srijith. I'm the CISO of Careem. Over to you, David.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Tsao. I'm the CISO at Instacart.
And I'm Philip Martin. I'm the CISO at Coinbase.
I'm David Cross. I'm a CISO for Oracle SaaS Cloud, also a venture partner with Rain Capital VC.
I'm Omar Khawaja. I'm the field CISO at DataBricks. I sit on the boards of High Trust and the FAIR Institute, and I teach at the CISO program at Carnegie Mellon.
Amazing. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me in this panel. It's going to be a very interesting panel because we have been talking about generative AI quite a bit in Black Hat EMEA this year. And looks like there are a lot more questions to be answered as well. But I guess the first and the most fundamental question probably is going to be, is there an option to just ignore it, be in a dark cave, not worry about it? It's going to go away if you hide under the sand for a while. So David, what do you think?
Well, if you choose to ignore it, you have to bear with the consequences. So, I mean, the short answer, I think, of course, is no. There's just way too much traction and excitement that we're seeing in this space. It simply cannot be ignored.
Yeah. And David Cross, what do you think?
Well, I think AI is just like is going to go away or not disappear. It's like saying social media is going to disappear. It's not going to happen. It's here forever.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves over time, because right now there is a hype, and at some point there is going to be a maturity and maybe a crust of disillusionment as well. So before we get into that part of it, if I look at generative AI, does this look like, Philip, for you, a business issue or something that's happening to the society and slowly invading the business side of it, and then security after that? What's your thought on that seeping of generative AI into everything that we touch in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally what AI does is AI makes things faster, right? AI doesn't, by and large, invent new things. AI doesn't make things necessarily, better per se, but it makes things faster. And I think that because of that, it serves to enhance and accelerate existing trends, right? Whether that be societal or technological or anything else. And so I think as we grapple with it, we have to deal with it in that context and think, well, what does this mean for my ability to respond, to react, to integrate?
Right. Okay. And Omar, any thoughts on how generative AI kind of moves on from, as Philip mentioned, the scale part of it, and then it just enables the daily individual to do things, which probably has a security angle to it then going forward, right?
Yeah, I think, as the other folks said, generative AI is out there. It's ubiquitous. The speed with which it's just come, it didn't sort of have a slow adoption. It was an immediate adoption. Everyone's gotten to experience it in one form or the other. It's definitely going to come. The question is it going to come in a way that it's going to be done with the risk being managed or not being managed? And one of the most interesting conversations I have is when I talk to chief data officers and when I talk to the business, they talk about how fast they are adopting AI. When I talk to CISOs, they talk about how their businesses aren't adopting AI. Mm-hmm. I'm like, there's a big disconnect. I remember talking to a CDO and he said, they deployed this app and they did this and they did this. I said, wow, this is really impressive that you did all of these things. And I said, well, you must have a very collaborative security team and a collaborative and a forward-thinking CISO that's thoughtful and well-prepared. And he laughed. And I said, well, what's so funny? He said, why would I ever tell the CISO we're doing this? Right, that's sort of the problem is Gen AI going to happen safely because of the CISO, or will it end up happening unsafely in spite of the CISO?
Yeah, it's a very interesting kind of a dichotomy, right? And maybe that leads to the next question I had, and I guess for all the panelists out here, as a CISO of your organization, what part of generative AI or AI in general keeps you awake at night? Like, it's a standard question, but there's a twist on the generative part. David Tsao?
So it's interesting you mentioned that, Omar, because I have responsibility for IT in my current role, and looking at the opportunity from a productivity perspective, of course, is massive. So I was asked to be part of essentially like this core AI working group to try to identify how do we consistently evaluate and select and implement the right types of AI tools for the company, just because there was such a groundswell of interest. We were having this problem where the demand was overwhelming kind of the traditional intake that IT would have. And so it was a helpful position to be there with security as a close partner to try to add some value and enable the business.
Yes.
And yet also getting that exposure into like how do these things actually work? And it's not just looking at implementing like the next AI feature in a SaaS solution. It was also looking at it from how do we bring in Gen AI and other technologies within our core product as well. So that was really helpful. And it's still very much an ongoing journey, but that's how we've been able to balance the productivity push with the security constraints.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Because when I think about what keeps me up at night about this, it is the same that keeps me up for any other new technology. It is that, number one, am I able to keep up? Does my team have the right skills? Are we engaged in the right places? Are we seeing the right things? Are we thought of as a blocker, right? As Omar said, or are we a value add? Because if we're a value add, we're going to be in the room, right? If we're a blocker, we're not going to be in the room. And the thing that truly terrifies me across sort of everything in security is the thing that I don't know about.
Yep. Fair enough. It's a good call.
You know, I often, when I talk to audiences about this, I start by asking the question if they're afraid of snakes. And almost everyone raises their hand and they say they're afraid of snakes. How many of the audience is afraid of snakes? Okay. Is there anyone in the audience that's not afraid of snakes?
No, doesn't look like it.
And invariably, what happens is when you ask people subsequently, you know, what percentage of snakes are scary, and most people are like, maybe not that many, and it turns out only 10 to 15% of snakes are actually venomous. Yet, as a general rule, a heuristic we've adopted is we're scared of all snakes. And the reason is we're not sure which ones are venomous or not, so the safe thing to do is to be afraid of all. And the people that say they're not afraid of snakes, it's because they understand snakes well enough, they grow up with them, and they know which ones are scary and which ones aren't. What happens with Gen AI is if you don't understand it well enough, you'll end up treating them like snakes and you'll assume they're all scary. But once you understand them well enough, and they're not novel and they're not unfamiliar, because the thing that's novel and unfamiliar and foreign, you automatically assume that there's something wrong and you proceed with caution. But the ability to understand what it is then sort of enables the reduction of the fear and the movement and the closer alignment with the business, as David mentioned. And the CISO can then get into the business of, I'm here enabling the business versus what oftentimes even me, a few months ago, I was thinking, this stuff is really scary. I don't know how it works. I don't know how to secure it. Can I find an excuse not to do it? That would make my life easy.
That's a good point. David, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's kind of like I mentioned before, everyone's going to use AI. Every business is going to have AI. Every operation is going to have AI. It's kind of like nowadays saying, a business, can you not be on the web? Of course you are. And I think it's, but at the same time, as everyone goes in the web, like security needs to be part of that, right? And I think that AI is the same thing. It's like, think about security, thinking about architecture, think about reliability, think about performance with AI. It's natural. Start from the beginning. This is one of the coolest things sometimes. We've all been there as people start going to the web, the internet, other things. Oh, there's a problem. Oh, better get security involved. You can start with security from the very beginning and avoid the disasters later on.
Yeah, and I think yesterday in one of the panels, somebody made the keen observation that AI and generative AI specifically, and kind of the security piece around it is very similar to what we had when we started using cloud, like a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I observed is that people probably learned a lesson which is skewed onto the other side of it, which is even before you understand how you use generative AI, you're starting to write policies of how to use generative AI securely, right? And so, David Tsao, do you have any thoughts, and maybe from your experience as well, where does policy and how to use generative AI securely lie with respect to how we use it within our enterprises? Like, which comes first? Probably is the first question, I guess.
Yeah. So for us, it actually was through experimentation and small iterations of learning how, specifically around Gen AI, how that really worked. I mean, as a company, we've been using AI for the most part for semantic search and other things for many years now. And as we began to deploy our own playground UI interfaces to ChatGPT and others, and began to integrate our internal structured data with these LLMs, and learn what worked and what didn't work well, and we began to realize, oh, yeah, we have to host our own vector databases. How are we going to deal with embeddings? All these different classic challenges, well, now classic challenges, of how you deal with some of these Gen AI tools. And that helped the security team to be in a better position to understand how these things work, and then to be a close partner with the engineering teams that were working on this. And we gave the high-level principles of just good engineering practices, which the engineering teams generally already knew. And it wasn't as if we wanted to define a heavy-handed policy at such an early stage, because a lot of it was still we're trying to understand. We don't really know exactly what the extent of the risks are, because the implementations were obviously evolving fairly quickly. So I think that's like a very quick approach, and it's ultimately going to be risk-based. Yep. So when you're doing this in a small kind of research and development phase, it's easy to do this with iterations. And to your point, as Omar's mentioned, like when you get to something that's more mature and you have to have a deeper understanding of the nuance, then it's easier to define the policy, and by then you'll have a lot more data to feed into what that policy looks like.
Yeah. And if I may ask kind of a slightly evolved part of that question to Philip, the next part of it, so you would assume that nobody wants to take risk in general. Like in life, you would not want to take risk. And security, in a way, is a risk, right? So if you look at employees of an organization, ideally, you would assume that they don't want to take the risk. But at the same time, they want to be able to be productive. They want to be able to use the latest, greatest technology, Gen AI being the current one. So where do you see policing of that usage and the policy that goes with it sitting with the actual productivity part of that conversation? Because as a CEO, as a CTO, or as a CIO, you want to be able to use this tool, but as a CISO, you want to be able to tell them, but use it correctly. So there is the policy part, and then there is the enforcement part of it, the stick and the carrot kind of thing. So what do you think about that notion of doing it correctly that way?
Well, so I think first, the point you made about people not wanting to take risk is perhaps correct, but it is the exact wrong way to think about this. If we were in the risk-free business, we should all just turn our computers off, throw them in the ocean, and walk away, right? Done. Yeah. Security achieved.
Yep.
Right? But we're not. And so we do want to take risk intelligently, and with forethought and with appropriate reward on the other side. And that's really the goal, right? And that's what the policy feeds, is that risk appetite and that ability to take that risk. And so I think the key to this whole thing is building that policy in a way that says very clearly to the business, here's the risk we're taking to enable the business to get this reward. More risk is actually counterproductive.
Yep.
Right? More risk puts us in a place where we might win in the beginning to lose in the end.
True.
And so we don't want that. And that's why we align to this standard. And at that point, the stick sort of builds itself, right? It's no longer about, oh, you violated the AI policy. It's you're putting the business at risk for this thing.
True. Yep. Thanks, Philip. David Cross. So recently, a few weeks ago, the U.S. had have an executive order on the use of AI, and there are different aspects of it which covers security in some shape or form. It talks about advanced cybersecurity program to develop AI tools, protect American privacy, and so on and so forth, right? Now, we are in a region outside of the US, but do you see that executive order being helpful in regions outside the US in how you think about AI, the right use of it, and the secure use of it?
Good question. I apologize for a cough there. It seems like every time I come on stage, I have to cough now. But I think I'll cover this. The executive order is kind of a challenging thing, but I'm going to take a positive view. Is I think sometimes is where governments can start to set the stage a little bit for things and becoming maybe a line in the sand. It may not be perfect, but it's versus everyone being kind of fuzzy, everyone guessing, everyone going one direction versus another is difficult. But sometimes it could say, here's a line in the sand. Industry, does this work? Other governments, do you want to develop your own independently? Or should you, reference, what's starting in this country? So I think that's an opportunity for us, right? And as always, sometimes do we want regulations for everything or over-regulate? Probably not. But at the same time, if we don't have some, it's not the right balance.
Right, yeah. And I guess, Omar, maybe a leading question, but regulations, there is a space for regulations and there's a time for the regulations. Probably right now is too early, but what's your thought on where and why would anybody want to regulate a technology which is in its nascent stages?
Yeah, it's a tough space because on the one hand, as consumers and as security professionals, it would be nice if someone just told us what to do.
Yep.
And they said, if you do these 3 things, you're going to be compliant, you're going to be secure, and we'd say, okay, phew, that made our life easy. On the other hand, whatever the regulators tell us to do, in 6 months we're going to find out it's wrong. So if the regulators wait a couple years to figure out what the right answer is, we're going to be annoyed with the regulators because they aren't telling us what to do. And then 2 years later, they're going to give us a long list of things, which is going to be different than what we've done. So the one thing is for sure, no matter what the regulators do, we're probably going to not like it. I think one thing that we often miss the boat on is, if you pay attention to the spirit of the regulation and to the spirit of the compliance, what you'll find is the goal of every single compliance regulation in our space is to actually make the organization secure, is to actually reduce risk. And so we often have this idea of security is not compliance. And in my mind, I think that's a very immature way of approaching it. Compliance exists. If compliance goes away, we know the things that happen. So instead of looking at compliance and using it as an excuse not to do the right thing, we should use compliance as a stepping stone to make sure we are doing the right thing, which ultimately is risk reduction. And it turns out, as I've talked to hundreds of regulators, that's the thing that they actually care about. I think finding some of those principles to abide by and letting industry then take that and take a little bit further, because if compliance regime says you have to do X, Y, and Z, and later on they say, no, it's X, Y, and B, or X, Y, and D, they're in trouble. But private industry has the opportunity to be way nimbler and make changes, but ultimately compliance is going to play a role.
It's a very, very valid point there, Omar. So if we have been spending a fair bit of time on talking about AI and its use by employees within an organization. If I may turn to the next phase of that set of questions, how many of you, and maybe a quick understanding of it would be interesting, use AI and generative AI or kind of AI models, LLM models within your organization? Would it be a right assumption that almost all of you would do it in some shape or form, right?
Yep.
So maybe kind of a question to you, Philip, to start with. Where do you see the security aspect of those systems that you are building, kind of placing it within the rest of the SDLC pipeline and everything? Like, where do you see that within the broader context of developing application security, maintaining system security, and so on?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because in the hype surrounding AI, I feel like there's this idea that's been created that AI is somehow different than other technologies out there. And yes, of course it is in the details. When you get down into the implementation, the tools are going to be different. But the governance of that technology has no difference. The way we think about secure design, at least from a conceptual perspective, is not particularly different. The way we think about an SDLC is not going to be particularly different. And so I think we have to, sort of take a step back, take a breath, and realize that this is no different conceptually than the introduction of mobile apps as a technology that developers are going to be using. and yes, we need to take a critical look at it, figure out how we integrate it into our SDLC, figure out what tools we want to use to get the right level of visibility and control. But we don't need to look at this as some sort of, paradigm-shifting technology change that has us re-architecting our entire AppSec program.
Yep, right. But maybe a follow-up question. I don't know, David, do you agree with that? Because I have a follow-up question. I'm assuming you agree with that notion, right? So now, what we have seen across the last few decades of doing things securely is that it takes a bit of time for security professionals to do things securely. I mean, writing code securely took a fair bit of time. Data, like generative AI, LLM models, and so on, they are kind of the niche realms of data scientists. At least that's what the common perception is, right? So when you're talking about a security professional tasked with looking at threat modeling of an LLM system, securing the data that goes into it, getting the output right, do you feel like there is enough knowledge within the security community and professionals, like practitioners, to do it right? Or do you feel like there is an upskilling needed in that way of securing the systems there?
Oh, this is a really good question. I think there's an element is if I go back, 10 plus years ago, then ML was starting to appear in the world and things like that. And how many people remember the old on Coursera, like Andrew Ng's kind of thing on Coursera? Let me learn ML.
Yeah.
As you start diving into it, you sometimes need that kind of refresh, maybe a bit of a baseline or education. And then once you get that, you say, oh, now I understand this as the fundamentals. I know how to apply these other security principles. I think a little bit about, and I welcome the other panel members, their feedback, is in some ways, okay, as a developer, security engineer, an analyst, looking at something like, all right, why don't you get some educated about AI, about models, about LLMs, and get that baseline, and so then saying, okay, now I need to do a little threat modeling, but you have the fundamentals in place, it's a little easier to start and get going. But it's not that I need to go get a 2-year education before I can be involved with this. And so I think if you do that, it's a really great start, and you can start building that versus having to reskill everybody in an enormous way. But I welcome other feedback.
Sure. If I could add on to that, I think like people think about threat modeling sometimes as an activity a security team does, like in a dark room somewhere alone.
Yeah.
Which is just not how threat modeling is done. Threat modeling is done in partnership with the teams that you're modeling with. And so as a security person in that room, I don't need to be an expert on LLMs because I have an expert sitting right there. I need to be an expert on security.
Yep.
And we need to have a conversation about, well, what happens if? What about if? And if we do this thing instead of that thing, how does that impact whatever? Now, I will grant you, not every organization does threat modeling like that, and doing threat modeling like that is hard, resource intensive, but it's how threat modeling needs to be done, especially for technologies like LLMs, where the expertise is not yet widespread.
Right, yeah. And David, if I may ask that kind of a question around, so what Philip basically mentioned was that when you do threat modeling, you do this with your counterpart within the engineering organization or the business and so on. And I guess that's very similar how you approach kind of generative AI modeling systems and so on within Instacart as well, right? So, but where do you see the importance of the security mindset that needs to be transferred to the rest of the organization when it comes to these systems? Like data scientists thinking from the point of security, thinking what goes into your training set so that it actually cannot be kind of exploited, how you need to validate things and so on. What's your thought on that, kind of doing it in the beginning?
So yeah, how do you establish that mindset, right? So I think at a very high level, what you're describing is how do you build that security culture within an engineering function or within teams that are not just security, but look at security as a value add and not simply introducing more friction or more pain. And it's one of the reasons that I think within the security practitioner field, having a hybrid builder-breaker type of role is incredibly powerful. Because how do you build that culture? You build it through trust. You build that through credibility and showing, I'm picking a tech company as an example, like an engineering team of why that threat model is actually practical and useful, and not just giving some theoretical advice that can be very expensive to implement. So when you have these hybrid builder breakers, and these are essentially software engineers that have a kind of breaker mindset, they have experience of building similar types of services that they're now also going to be doing these reviews on. And there's other ways you can solve this. I'm not saying this is the only path, but I found it's one of the kind of easier wins to get when looking at how to skill teams up. To give another analogy, within software engineering, there is a path where a software engineer can learn to become a machine learning engineer, but if you have that foundational capability in software engineering, and I think the same opportunity exists for security practitioners that have that software engineering background to also then learn these new practices, whether that's generative AI today or whatever new technology that comes up in the future.
Good point. Omar, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the thing I'd add to it is I agree with what Philip said in terms of like the principles of how you do security doesn't change. You need monitoring, you need logging, you need authentication, you need access control. Those sort of fundamentals are exactly the same for AI. What really changes is the where you do it. And the thing that makes AI more complex is, as David Tsao was saying, is on the one hand, it's about software engineering because ultimately you have to take these models and serve them some way through an application or an API interface. But then you also have this whole world of models, and then you also have this whole world of data. So you take data, you take models, you take applications, each of which have fairly distinct life cycles and processes and roles and responsibilities. Now you've mashed all of them together and you've created this world of LLMs and generative AI. And from a security perspective, you're thinking, okay, if I'm dealing with prompt injection, well, where do I deploy the controls? I know the controls, but where do I do it? Is it at the training data? Is it somewhere in the middle? Is it the model? These data people talk about this thing called feature stores. What the hell does that mean? There's this thing called model monitoring, and there's this thing called model serving, and there's this thing called model gateway. And so those are all sort of newer constructs and asset types. Like we know databases, we know containers, we know a lot of those types of technology constructs. These technology constructs are not familiar to organizations, particularly security teams, that are newer to AI. But once we familiarize ourselves with these, then we'll be. But I think the biggest opportunity is if you can give security teams a picture of what AI looks like, then they can use the tools of threat modeling and risk assessment and everything else and identify the right system of controls to manage risk.
Yep.
If I could add one point, I think kind of tying what Omar said and Philip said, it's kind of like the education and the principles, to all the stakeholders. But then the threat modeling is I can't really, sure enough is that the best threat modeling is you bring a diverse set of people, the engineers, everyone, the security people, the brainstorming, coming together. You kind of got some fundamentals, some basic education, and then talking through it and brainstorming. That diverse set of people looking at the problem set and being open-minded is the best threat models I've ever seen in my career.
Yep, that's right. And there was an interesting conversation I was having with a gentleman yesterday, and one of the observations was, whatever technology that comes up today or will come up tomorrow, security probably is one of those professions where you have to be at the forefront of it because you need to be understanding of what that implications are. You need to understand whether it's a risk that you need to kind of downgrade to kind of get to a point where we can say, okay, it's mitigated and so on. So I guess generative AI and AI in general is one of those kind of cool things that security professionals need to be on top of. Now, if you look at it from the point of view of how you would use generative AI and AI in general for securing your enterprise, right? So this is not the risk because of generative AI, but the aspect of how do you use it for the betterment of security. So David Tsao, do you have any thoughts on how you could use things like Copilot kind of to write securely? I have a kind of a weird question as a follow-up based on that answer, of course.
Yeah, I think we're seeing still in early days at least two fairly obvious use cases where kind of the Copilot model can help. So the first one's the more traditional kind of SOC analyst, tier one. How do you review all the different alerts that are coming into your system and prioritize what are the actual actionable investigations that you should try to lead? The second one, though, is I think it's equally interesting, if not more so. and that's a variation of kind of software quality assurance. Now, in a shop that's kind of test-driven development, where you're supposed to have your developers write your test cases as you develop your code, I think in practice, a lot of companies struggle with having adequate test coverage.
Yep.
And what we're finding is you can use Gen AI to help analyze your code, come up with proposed test cases, yes, to test it from a functional perspective, but the security perspective is super interesting, because there you're looking for adversarial user stories and adversarial test cases, and develop those in parallel. So it's essentially like a low-level kind of security review, if you will, that Gen AI can help kind of pre-populate that, and so then the security engineers can take that and build on it much more effectively and much faster, versus having to create all that from scratch.
Fair enough. And Philip, maybe a kind of a question that begs another question from it is, right? So we're looking at Copilot and the use of kind of coding capabilities to write unit tests, kind of what David Tsao mentioned. But how do we make sure that the tests that's written are actually an accurate depiction of the environment? Like, how do you trust the output of an AI system? Because everybody is very, very aware of the hallucination that ChatGPT comes out with, right? So as a security professional and a CISO who is responsible for overall security of your environment, how much kind of capability do you want to give it out to the AI systems who would be tasked with protecting your systems?
Well, I would ask a different question, which is, why would you trust humans to write test cases?
That's a fair question.
Right? Like, I think the original frame of your question comes from a place of like, humans are great at this, which they're demonstrably not, right? But I think it's the same answer, which is, I think you focus on code coverage metrics, you ensure that the tests that are written by AI or humans go through a review process, go through a suitability review, are not just sort of like written and trusted and done. Because, again, AI makes things faster, not better, not necessarily worse, just faster. And so all the same controls and processes we would have on that human writing that test, we should put on that AI writing that test.
Right, fair enough. David Cross, a question around the TPRM, the third-party risk management process and programs that organizations run, right? So when it comes to evaluating an organization that you rely on for your supply chain or your services outsourcing, how should CISOs start thinking about the use of generative AI processes within those organizations that you rely on for your services? Like, how does it impact your TPRM process in general?
Well, I think overall, the way I think about it is I go back to a paper that I kind of helped write with, the teammate community on that, and looking at the enterprise risks. And part of it is looking at overall is every business is different, right? Every business has a different risk, a different profile, different goals. And looking at each of those in those individual businesses is that, do you have an IP risk here? Do you have a privacy risk here? Do you have a copyright risk here? Because everybody can be slightly different, right? And thinking about that up front and how, if something did occur, what it mean, and then that can guide you in some of the directions that you want to take. On another, different kind of a tangent that I do want to share with the audience here to think about is, there's some companies, high-tech companies, big companies, that you can have lots of expertise, you can have lots of tools in building, but there's a lot of businesses out there that you're not an expert. You may not have the expertise, but this is where opportunities, things like Black Hat and other things, is the startup community out there. There's a ton of businesses, a lot of experts that are appearing, and it's okay to say, we want to dive into AI and LLMs, but we don't have the technology, the expertise. This is where the best times is take advantage of the startup community, take advantage of all these of this innovation, take advantage of all these vendors that can help you in building and using those things that you may not have the expertise internally from the very start.
That's a good point. And Omar, maybe kind of combining the observation that David just mentioned and Philip's previous observation, which is that AI is faster. It may not be better, but it's faster. Now, if you look at it in that context, do you feel like the use of AI capabilities is that silver bullet that will help solve what's traditionally called the kind of the skill set gap and the inability to produce skilled practitioners of security at the pace that's needed? Do you feel like that silver bullet exists? And if it does, or if security AI is kind of that silver bullet, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the potential is very, very significant. I think if it's not done carefully, it may end up backfiring, and we start to think of this as something that's dangerous, and we don't want to use it. So the example I gave, well, I'll skip the example. I think it absolutely can be, and thinking through how, like, this is where we have to leave the old waterfall ways of we'll spend 3 months to plan, we'll get it perfect, we'll execute, it'll never go the way we thought it would, even though we spent 3 months planning it, and then it'll take us 2 years to finally get to the end, and then someone new will come in and finally admit that we made a mistake. Like, we don't have the time to go through 2.5 years of cycles the way we've typically done. With Gen AI, we need to be able to say, we're gonna do it, we're gonna make a mistake, it's gonna be imperfect, let's figure out how to do it such that the mistakes we make are very small. The mistakes we make, we identify very quickly, and we iterate, and we do it very quickly, which is much of what Dave Tsao was saying. That's really important. So even when you tune the AI, you can set something called a temperature. So you can decide on the spectrum, do you want it to be like math, where there's only one right answer, 2 + 2 is always 4, or do you want it to be more sort of on the arts and creativity side, which is, what color is your favorite today? And I can change my mind all the time, and you have no reproducibility. So learning AI and being able to tune some of these settings and parameters and the training data and temperatures to be able to say, you know, like, there are levers in AI that you can use to reduce your risk and to increase your risk. Now, certainly for some functions, you do want it to be more creative. And what experts in machine learning will tell you, hallucinations are not a bug. Hallucinations are a feature.
Yep.
Right? Just like with humans, when we're creative and we do things and say things that are crazy, we call them artists and musicians and singers and songwriters and dancers, right? But in the world of AI, we think we compare it to things that are very deterministic in computer programs, and when it doesn't give you the same answer twice, we think there's something wrong. But that's because we're asking it to be creative, and creative people don't say the same thing twice.
So you're saying that AI has gotten to a point where it has creative kind of instincts within capabilities it has, and one of the things that you would assume is that, like, capabilities which require scale, like the ability to respond to incidents, like the fact that you need to do it in a very short period of time, the fact that you need millions of records to be looked at, it seems to be that hard AI capability that needed, right? So if you look at beyond generative AI, and if you just look at AI and machine learning as a concept, do you feel like Security Operations Center or a Fusion Center would be those ideal places where you would see the application of generative AI and machine learning? Maybe a question to all the panelists quickly to wrap up.
I think it's very interesting, because I think in that Security Operations Center context, there's the potential for generative AI to level the sort of data sourcing and summarization step that can create a big difference among especially junior analysts. But I think it is not at a place yet where it's gonna really, perhaps it will augment but not replace the intuitive judgment that we then ask those humans to make about what does it mean versus how do we collect and summarize it.
Yeah, fair enough.
You know, I'll maybe add, there's this term I heard, it's called algorithmic aversion. And so it's the idea that we expect the algorithm to be perfect, but it's okay for the human to make mistakes. And this is the point that Phil was making earlier, is if the AI is just doing what the human is doing faster, And when the human makes a mistake and crashes the car, we accept that as an acceptable risk of driving cars with humans. But when the algorithm makes a mistake, we're like, why did it make a mistake? Even though the algorithms are way more safer than the average human, it's just the way that the algorithm makes a mistake, sometimes it feels grosser, but if you look at it objectively, the algorithms often are safer. But that idea of, that's a very human thing, to basically expect the algorithm to be perfect because it's a computer, and we've expected computers to do everything perfectly for so long, and it's okay for humans to make mistakes. That's something as a society and culture we have to overcome, and we have to be able to evaluate and assess and monitor models for their efficacy. And what humans need to do is figure out, how do I evaluate the success and the efficacy of this model? Is it accuracy? Is it toxicity? Is it ethics? Is it behavior? Is it privacy? And this is where the world of security gets tougher, because we jump into it and say we're going to do the security of it, but very quickly it bleeds into ethics, and it bleeds into culture, and it leads into brand, and it leads into things that really have not traditionally been the CISO's domain, but somehow we're expected to now figure these things out. And we're used to being best friends with the IT auditor and best friends with maybe the CPO and with the compliance person. But now all of a sudden we have to be best friends with HR, and we have to be best friends with marketing, and we have to be best friends with legal, because they're the people that have to help us sort through some of these items.
True. And we are just out of time, but I would love to understand or get your thoughts on one thing which has been nagging me for a while. So we used to have day traders, and that day traders got overtook by algorithmic traders at some point. So do you feel like at some point you're going to have two AI systems, the attacking systems and the defending systems, and we as CISOs and we as security professionals can probably take a backseat? I know it sounds like a flippant question, but it gives a feel of where you think the AI within security domain is going. And maybe like a question for each one of you, where do you think it's going to end up? Would it be two different AI systems battling it out? And where's the place of humans in there? David? Yes.
I do agree with Philip where this is speeding things up, and I think there was a VC that referred to AI as amplified intelligence.
Right.
So at least for the predictable short-term future, that certainly seems within the realm of reality. In terms of seeing actual AIs at war with each other, I would love to see what that could look like in the future, but I don't see it. That's not obvious to me, at least.
Not yet, at least.
Yeah, I largely agree with David. I think if we, from an unbounded time perspective, eventually, sure, right, probably.
Yeah.
But from a visible timeline, what we can see and predict today, no.
No. Okay.
I'll make one comment. It's saying crime, human history, it's always been the same. It's a horse race. Leap ahead, leap ahead, leap ahead, leap ahead. It's going to continue, and AI is going to be the same.
I agree. I think if the new battleground is AI, then there's going to be good AIs and there's going to be bad AIs, and the good guys are going to use AIs to assess their AIs, because only AI can keep up with AI. Humans aren't going to be able to evaluate AI, and the term for that is, again, it's a generative adversarial network, again, which is exactly the point of it, is to actually attack the other AI and assess the AI and to evaluate it to make sure it's operating the way it should.
All right. With that, thank you everyone for being part of this amazing talk. A whole lot of information around generative AI, the risk within an enterprise, and so on. Thank you to all the four gentlemen on here on the panel with me. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.